So Jose, again, talking about your fund setup, and we've heard a little bit about your project earlier today. Hey, if we can just dive in and maybe just, again, give a little bit of a background. I mean, Kira did this a little bit and some others, but, you remind people how and why you ended up in Puerto Rico and what you're doing. And then we can get into a little bit about the specifics of and nuances of the fund execution, your experience with that.
No, sounds great. And I really want this to be interactive. I'm not here to show you how to set up a fund. I'm not here to show you or recommend structures. What I really wanted to do was, it's been 2.5 years. And like I mentioned on the last presentation, I met Maria at Los Angeles, mostly because of conferences outside of Puerto Rico. If you think about it, back in the end of or beginning of 2019, through that whole year, most of the conferences were in the US. People were talking about Puerto Rico, but there was no real clear path of doing deals in Puerto Rico. I was really focused on renewable energy, so I spent the first year trying to figure out how to do renewable energy deals through an opportunity zone fund. There's tax benefits from renewable energy deals that really made a lot of sense. If you can put a limited partner that could take the investment tax credits in the US, it's the holy grail. We could create a pretty cool structure that will help bring capital to Puerto Rico. So that was the strategy. And we spent over 1.5 years. We had investors. But as you all might know, in Puerto Rico, none of those deals were utility scale deals with PREPA as the utility off-taker got done. So we had to revisit the strategy. And that's really what happened. I was doing deals in Puerto Rico. The fund that I used to work with didn't want to continue, and I saw that there was an opportunity. So it was really learning about opportunity zones, relearning about Puerto Rico, because when you're a US-based investor doing large deals, using capital from the US, bank loans from the US, you come to Puerto Rico purely as a financial investor. Well, all the things you guys have been talking about, patience, about dealing with the government, about, I don't want to call it incompetence, but I want to call it the inefficiencies. There's so many inefficiencies that when you are dealing with them, it actually drives you from the deal. We were talking about you need to have a good deal. If the deal is not good, it doesn't matter how you structure in an opportunity zone business. However, what happens is, we've heard it over and over, the deals change, the deals take time, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges with opportunity zone, is that timeline of being able to execute and invest in a deal. So I've been here I moved, I was in San Francisco, and that flight from San Francisco to Puerto Rico got really tiring. Is to take the red eye, get here in the morning, do meetings, be here for 3 or 4 days, and go back. And frankly, I with what was going on, you do need to be local because the regulations are changing. The deals are changing, and if you're not in this environment, it's really hard for a US-based investor to come here and in 180 days do a transaction. It just doesn't happen. So that was the first decision, was come to Puerto Rico. I do have a couple of slides, and I just want to use one later because I want to use that. For me, the biggest challenge is, as a fund manager, right? I was focusing on the structure of the fund. I really forgot about the investor at the beginning. I really forgot about the qualified opportunity zone business, right? You're just so focused about what is my fund going to do? How do I structure a fund? I said, well, I want to be a private equity fund investing in multiple assets. And that's what we did. That's how I know how to do business. And I said, that's perfect. Well, that was fine. But then we started looking at what happens if you want to have Puerto Rican investors. Well, I can no longer invest in US deals. That interaction, those decisions kept going pretty much every time that we had to make a decision. I would have to call Maria and say, Maria, so exactly how does it work if I want to have Puerto Rican investors take advantage? Well, at first it's not clear because the regulations are not out. Slowly, things became more clear. And basically, you need to invest only in Puerto Rico, the fund, if you want a Puerto Rican investor to take the benefit. So that was one of the first big decisions and challenges that happened kind of after the fund strategy was there. And that really didn't have to do with the fund. That had to do with being able to pass that benefit to Puerto Rican investors. So I would say that was one of the first difficult decisions that we had to make, because as everybody mentioned, deals in Puerto Rico take time. One of the benefits of investing in the US was if the deals in Puerto Rico were not going, I could deploy that capital in the US. But then that meant that I would be really foregoing any Puerto Rican investor coming into the fund. And my goal was to bring capital to Puerto Rico. And at the end of the day, US investors really want to see also local investors, right, as part of the capital. So I came back and I said, okay, Maria Los Angeles, we're going to do a Puerto Rico only fund. However, I had already started the process. I have a Delaware entity and I didn't want to change a lot of the regulatory filings. So we try to keep the Delaware entity, basically the fund, and try to fit that into this new strategy of just investing in Puerto Rico. It wasn't clear, but through Maria and the law firms, we figure out, yes, you can be a US based fund. You just have to invest all in Puerto Rico. So that was the second challenge that we kind of had to jump. Can you be a Puerto Rico LLC and take advantage of the Puerto Rico Opportunity Zone tax incentives by applying for a decree? Yes, you can, but we thought that at the end of the day, we would stick with our original strategy and continue to grow on that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share a screen to kind of put that chart that everybody likes to see, that kind of talks about the investors, that kind of talks about let's see, oops. Let me know if you guys are seeing the, yep, there we go. So I won't go about my background. You guys have seen that already. I won't go about the opportunity zones, but really what we're talking about here is that we're doing deals in Puerto Rico. So that's the first point that you have to take into account. And if you're doing deals in Puerto Rico, you have to deal with Puerto Rico tax jurisdiction issues. You have to deal with the fact that Puerto Rico has its own opportunity zone law that might or might not apply to your deals. And then you have to deal with the fact that Puerto Rico has those tax incentives. And that has a lot to do with the structure. Yes, you're not investing because of the tax, but the tax drives some of the businesses that you're investing in. So you have to still be familiar. You need to understand it. I won't go over the tax jurisdiction issues, but one thing that was really a surprise for me, and it's a really simple one, is that in Puerto Rico, a default election for an LLC is actually to be taxed as a corporation. That is completely the opposite of everything that I do in the US. So that was one little thing that I always tell people, did you file your tax? Did you tell your accountant that if you want a pass-through, he has to elect to be a pass-through? Most people don't, and their accountant simply just files their taxes as a corporation. Again, little mistakes, little learning experience, but that's one thing that I tell every US investor. They don't recognize that. They set up an LLC and they think it's a pass-through vehicle. So little things like that is what I want to share as my experience, which probably all of you guys have seen and experienced, but unfortunately you kind of learn after the fact, not at the beginning. The Puerto Rico Opportunity Zone law, I actually talked to the government and I said they did an awful job. They confused everybody. They should have simply said, we're making a law for Puerto Ricans to be able to participate and have the tax benefit. They created priority projects. They created a committee to approve projects. People got confused. Does that mean that QOS need to be approved by the Puerto Rico government? Does that mean that if you want to invest in an opportunity zone business, you have to get the government of Puerto Rico approval? The answer is no. But when the legislation came out and the press releases came out, every single investor that I was talking to kind of got a little bit of cold feet saying, we don't want to do anything that is subject to having approvals by the government. So I just kind of put this into perspective, which is the actual OZ law is a federal law. Puerto Rico just kind of lazy, like I would say, said, well, we're just going to copy it. Now, a lot of the things that they're doing is, oh, there's forms that are federal form. We have to create those forms ourselves. And they created it after taxes were due, because we were calling them, asking them, so what form can an investor fill out if it's a federal form? Oh, well, we'll come on. And I guess Maria Los Angeles pointed it out earlier today. We were asking, DDEC and Hacienda, and they just keep pointing fingers. Oh, it's really Hacienda's problem because it's a form that Hacienda has to do, but who is responsible for the program is DDEC. Anyway, my point is, those are the little things that are going to take time in Puerto Rico, right? Because all you have is something that says is the federal law. But as every time there's a quarter and you have to do something that has a federal, and you're looking for the Puerto Rico equivalent, things are coming out. So I think that that's what I wanted to point out about the Puerto Rico Opportunity Zone law, is that at the end of the day, every day you're learning something new, because it's a federal law that Puerto Rico has to interpret. One thing that they did clarify for me, which was critical, that whatever is amended on the law, Puerto Rico has to accept it, which basically means that if they do an extension for investing your capital, Puerto Rico has to do the same thing. That's critical, because otherwise that could have created a lot of not only issues and confusions, but that could have created a lot of complications for any fund manager that is looking to invest in Puerto Rico and have two separate OC laws. We talked about all of the Act 60. I think the point that I would rehash here is that if you have a benefit that has anything to do from a tax decree on any project, then you can forget completely about the Puerto Rico Opportunity Zone. Okay, so that's my only advice. If you have a tax decree, or your company has a tax decree, you can forget about the Puerto Rico Opportunity Zone law. You can apply as a fund manager to take the 18%, 18.5% income tax and things of that nature, but you don't really have to. It's just a benefit that you can ask for. This is the slide that I wanted to use for the Q&A, because for me, this is the slide that I was talking about. I was really always focusing on what the QF had to be, what the QF had to do, what the QF had to comply. But like I mentioned, you almost have to start from the top and the bottom. Who do we want? The investor needs to say, where do I want to invest? What do I want to invest in, right? And what are the tax implications? With that feedback, then you understand the investor that's coming to you, and then you can take that into account to the end of the day and put it into the fund formation and strategy. Why do I mention that? I got a lot of investors saying, well, I want yield, I want distributions. And I was like, well, if that's what you want, that's fine, but that's probably not going to be a good match for us, because we're looking at maximizing capital appreciation. And that's just, part of the strategy that we had. So thinking about the investors as part of your structure is really important. If you create your structure and then you look for investors, you're almost kind of narrowing down the pool without knowing it. But the other point that I would make about the investor is really understanding the fact that a Puerto Rican investor and a US investor will, if you want both of them, has a significant constraint on your fund. I'm going to skip the Qualified Opportunity Fund because I want to talk about the Qualified Opportunity Zone business. I'm not talking so much real estate, because there's a lot of people focused on real estate and there's a lot of expertise in real estate. I'm not a real estate investor. But when you start talking about Opportunity Zone businesses, there's constraints that businesses need to abide by, which means that not all the businesses are necessarily good candidates for attracting Qualified Opportunity Zone capital. And I mentioned that, and I just put here some of the points, because I've seen a lot of people come to me and said, I want to raise Opportunity Zone capital. And when I look at their business model, I kind of suggest, no, you don't, right? No, you don't, because it's really going to limit what you're really trying to achieve. So I always put that into perspective, and that's something that I wasn't thinking about. Other things is, if you have businesses that have tax decree, right? doing anything that could potentially challenge their tax decree and their benefits is extremely important. So again, understanding how that business is operating and the value of that business, don't create a structure that actually can stop the business from fulfilling all of their goals. And then before I talked about the QOF, other considerations, because that's something that, we jumped about doing a PPM, right? An information memorandum. We went and get the SEC filings and exemptions, and we did a lot of that almost too early. Why? Because we were advised that, from an SEC perspective, we wanted to do that. There's also the Puerto Rico Office of Financial Institutions. So there was a number of layers that we really wanted to make sure we were covered. But I think we were a little too early on that, because decisions about whether you're going to invest only in Puerto Rico and invest in the US or both could have an impact on that. The strategy, capital appreciation versus something that is giving current distribution, that has to do a lot with how you want to be structured from a tax perspective. So that was one of those intangible things that I think came out after the fact that we have to keep revisiting based on the strategy that we put together. Consultants, extremely important. Obviously, I'll do a plug for Grant Thornton. They're probably the top tax advisor because they've been following this from day one. But also, I think it's extremely important to have US and Puerto Rican advice, because if you have any US investors, at the end of the day, you have to understand how these decisions that we're making are going to impact that investor. Same thing with legal. I started with a US law firm and a Puerto Rican law firm. I had to restructure this and try to look for a law firm that was both in Puerto Rico and the US, because most of the things that we started with were all federal, right? OZ federal law. But then as soon as I came to Puerto Rico, it's all very local tax legal driven. So I kept having two law firms having to review pretty much every document that we have. So that's something that, again, if you're looking at doing anything with US investors and Puerto Rico and OZ, I think that, there's many different law firms, there's different ways to do it, but it's extremely important of how you coordinate, because you get a different response from a Puerto Rican lawyer and a US lawyer when you ask a similar question. It's how you ask the question, you're going to get potentially different answers. So going through these iterations with two different law firms became a little difficult. When you have the same law firm and you have the two partners and you tell them, you guys agree on how to answer this question, it really became a big benefit, right? It's the same firm. You guys, here's one question. You guys have to come up with one answer. When you have two different law firms, it's very difficult to do that. I would say, going back to the QOF, the reason I went around before we talked about the QOF is my biggest advice is go through all of those if anybody's going to start a QOF. Because if you start with the QOF and you start putting the structure and you haven't gone through all of those other items, you're going to do one of the mistakes that I did, which was create a structure that might not be the most efficient to begin with. So I would just highlight this key points. Are you going to have investors from the US and Puerto Rico, one or the other, or both? For me, that was what we probably spend the most time and potentially money going around the implications of those scenarios. Is the QF located in Puerto Rico or the US? I would say Maria Los Angeles mentioned that it doesn't really matter. What it really matters is how you put it all together. So this is one of those where we just decided to be a Delaware limited partnership, but we're going to end up being taxed as a corporation for different reasons. So could it have been an LLC to begin with instead of a partnership? Absolutely. Little things like that, I would say, that are important from an efficiency perspective. I think the other important one is what you will invest in, right? When you talk about real estate, there's appreciation benefits. There's a large number of things that drive this structure and that business. When you're talking renewable energy, there's different things that ITCs, federal tax benefits you need to take into consideration. There's construction risk or there's no construction risk. So I thought that that was part of when we were doing this originally. We were just going to do utility scale renewable energy projects with long-term contracts, basically large transactions that are more of an infrastructure. Now we're kind of going more into the operating businesses because those are faster, easier to execute, and you can control those decisions a little faster. What type of fund? Single asset or multi-asset fund? Another key driver on the structure of how you go about structuring the fund documentation and the limited partnership agreement or the operating agreement of the fund. I think that's kind of the comments I had. I really want to open it up for questions. I'll leave this slide up in case anybody wants to use it, but I just wanted to stop there and let people ask questions or other people chime in with their own experiences.
Jose, this is just, it's incredible information. I know, like, just hearing, again, like we did with Kira, like hearing firsthand, it's so valuable. And so I would just kind of say, Maria's here as well. Maria, is there anything that you, if you can hear me, that you'd like to add to anything that Jose presented here?
Well, basically, it's advisors, consultants, we always say don't enter the zone alone, because it's highly technical, and especially when you're combining that with another jurisdiction, which is Puerto Rico. And again, for US purposes, Puerto Rico is a foreign jurisdiction. So a lot of planning and strategy has to be done ahead, considering who your investors are going to be, and everything that Jose mentioned, in order to be able to cover all, the different bases and be as well prepared as possible. Jose mentioned that for Puerto Rico investors, and it makes sense, Puerto Rico Treasury is giving away the benefit. It's not the IRS. So what the Puerto Rico Treasury wants is investment in Puerto Rico if they're going to forgo Puerto Rico tax dollars. So that's key. If you're a US QOF, you can invest in a Puerto Rico QOCB, as we mentioned this morning. It's for OC purposes. A Puerto Rico entity is considered domestic and only for OC purposes. So a US fund can invest in Puerto Rico as long as the business is investing in Puerto Rico. It's created in Puerto Rico and investing in Puerto Rico. That's something very basic. But maybe because it's so basic, we kind of forget about it. And because it goes back to the first definition of what is a qualified opportunity zone business, and they start with a domestic. Okay, so again, a domestic entity, and Puerto Rico entities are not domestic for US purposes. So that's key. And also what Jose mentioned, and we mentioned also, if we have in Puerto Rico, we have a plethora of incentives that you have seen. And we also have what it's called the priority projects that usually are misunderstood as the OC program in Puerto Rico. That's totally different. Priority project is just another incentive to do business in Puerto Rico. You don't have to be a priority project to be able to receive opportunity zone investment. A QOF can invest in any type of business in Puerto Rico with incentives or no incentives. It doesn't matter as long as it meets all the tests to be a qualified opportunity zone business. And in addition, if it's a Puerto Rico entity, it has to be operating in Puerto Rico.
I love what you said, like, don't go in the zone alone. It's like, that should be on a t-shirt, right?
Yeah.
It's so true. And, I can even speak, this is Puerto Rico side, but, we set up Osworth Group as a QOZB, and I've invested my own gains into a fund and to fund that. And even being close to experts, it took a while to understand it and wrap my head around it. And so, utilize this network, these resources, if we're all here to support one another. There's two quick questions that I want to get to. Jose, just a clarifying piece and component. Did you say Act 22ers should not do OZ investments? That was just a clarifying.
No, that wasn't me. And actually, there is a very good reason why Act
Mhm.
22 should look into opportunity zone. I think
Mhm.
Act 22 gets misunderstood by many people. You only qualify for investments that you do after you move to Puerto Rico. So if you have any investments prior to Puerto Rico and you generate capital gains, that's grandfather over time. So I have a lot of people say me, this is not applicable for Act 22ers, and
Mhm.
no, the other way around. People that are really in tune with their taxes and move to Puerto Rico to avoid taxes is a perfect program to add to their tax management tools for any capital that they have that is not grandfather and that they
Mhm.
want to take out and reinvest. And the holy grail from my perspective is to invest as much as you can in Puerto Rico. So if you have assets in the US that you can transfer into Puerto Rico and do it in a tax advantage way, that's even better. So if I mentioned that, it was not what I was trying to say.
Appreciate the
Mhm.
clarification. And is there?
I just want to, Chris, I just want to add that those Act 22ers that are living already in Puerto Rico and have this type of gain that are US, type of gains, they have to file both the US election and the Puerto Rico election, the OC schedule we mentioned, in order to be covered from the Puerto Rico side, because that gain as being US allocated would be subject to tax in Puerto Rico. But then if they do the election, using the OC schedule, that would be covered by the deferral also.
Cool. There's another sort of more, I think it's a bigger context question. So this is talking about, holding the hands of politicians to sort of help shape best practices. That's
I just want to say in Puerto Rico, there are two favorite sports, basketball and politics. That's the second major sport. So, politicians are, it's hard, and we as a private business, community in Puerto Rico try to, meet with them and educate them, meet with the agency directors. But sometimes, it's just not possible. I mean, they're just there for the votes mostly, and they will do whatever they can to get votes.
Well, and this is also not just like it's a Puerto Rico thing. It's also a general,
Mhm.
and what we're talking about is a incentive that was passed through government legislation and then is now designed to be applied to entrepreneurs and in areas that normally don't have access to the type of knowledge that lean toward being able to be investable or invested in. So there are complexities to all of this. And one of the things that, we want to do and be as a bridge so that we can have clear lines of communication between all this. So,
and also we cannot lose the perspective of the board. We're still under the fiscal oversight board, and they have to pass judgment upon every single law that is approved in Puerto Rico. So that, that also makes things to go a little bit slower than we would like to, because, the board has a there.
Yeah, that's a whole nother sort of like layer to all this, but it's real. And so I again, incredibly grateful for both of you sharing your perspectives. And Jose, do you have a follow up? Yeah.
I'm gonna have to leave, but thank you. I just put in my email in case anybody wants to contact me. And thank you again for putting this together.
Thanks, Jose. We'll see you soon.